The Wayfarer. I came upon him on the road. I pulled over, stepped out, walked directly over to him where he sat, on an old milestone. His long tangled beard was yellowish grey, his eyes dull with the dust of the road. His clothes were all of a colour and smelled of mildew. He was not a sympathetic figure, but what could I do? I stood for a while in front of him, hands on hips, but he paid me no heed. I thought, at least he will stand. He did not. I scuffed up a little dust between us with the toe of my boot. The dust settled or disappeared into his collection of it. But still he stared obliviously, vacantly, perhaps, I thought, mindlessly. Yet I could be sure he was alive, for he sighed deeply from time to time. He is afraid to acknowledge me, I reasoned. It may or may not have been the case, but it served for the time being as a useful premise. The sun was hot, the air dry. It was silent, except for the traffic. I cleared my throat, shifted my feet, made a large business of extracting my memo book from my breast pocket, tapped my pencil on it loudly. I was determined to perform my function in the matter without regard to how disagreeable it might prove to be. Others passed on the road. They proffered smiles of commiseration, which I returned with a pleasant nod. The Wayfarer wore a floppy black hat. Tufts of yellow-grey hair poked out of the holes in it like dead wheat. No doubt, it swarmed. Still, he would not look at me. Finally, I squatted and interposed my face in the path of his stare. Slowly, painfully it would seem, his eyes focused on mine. They seemed to brighten momentarily, but I am not sure why. It could have been joy as easily as rage, or it could have been fear. Only that his eyes brightened. His face remained slack and inexpressive, and it was not a glow, nothing that could be graphed. It was just a briefest spark, a glimmer. Then dull again. Filmy as though with a kind of mucus smeared over. And he lost the focus. I don't know whether or not in that instant of perception he noticed my badge. I wished at the time that he would, then there could be no further ambiguities. But I frankly doubted that he did. He has travelled far, I thought. I had begun with the supposition that he feared me. It is generally a safe supposition. Now I found myself beset with doubt. It could have been impatience, I reasoned, or anger, or even contempt. The thought, unwonted, jolted me. I sat back in the dust. I felt peculiarly light, baseless. I studied my memo book. It was blank. My God, it was blank. Urgently, I wrote something in it. There. Not so bad now. I began to recover. Once again, I supposed it was fear. I was able to do that. I stood, brushed the dust off my trousers, then squatted down once again, and now with a certain self-assurance. Duty, a proper sense of it, is our best teacher. My catechism was coming back to me. He would enjoy no further advantages. I asked him about himself, received no answers. I recorded his silence in my book. I wrote the word aphonia, then erased it. True, I could have determined the matter, a mere palpitation of the neck cords, but the prospect of dipping my fingers into the cavities behind that mouldy beard revolted me, and the question, after all, was not of primary concern. Moreover, a second method then occurred to me. If I could provoke a sound out of him, any sound, it would prove that the vocal mechanism was still intact. Of course, if he uttered no sound, it would not establish that he was mute, but I felt confident I could provoke a sound and have an end to the problem. I unstrapped my rifle from my back and poked the barrel under his nose. His gaze floated unimpeded down the barrel, through my chest, and out into indeterminate space. I asked him his name. I asked him the president's name. I asked him my name. I reminded him of the gravity of his violation, and of my own unlimited powers. I asked him what day it was. I asked him what place it was. He was adamant. I lowered the barrel and punched it into his chest. The barrel thumped in the thick coats he wore, and something cracked, but he said nothing. Not so much as a whisper. He did not even wince. I was becoming angry. Inwardly, I cautioned myself, and still that old man refused. I say refused, although it may not have been a question of volition. In fact, it was not, could not have been, to look at me. I lowered the barrel and punched it into his groin. I might as well have been poking a pillow. He seemed utterly unaware of my attentions. I stood impatiently. I knew, of course, that much was at stake. How could I help but know? Those passing were now less sympathetic, more curious, more reproving. I felt the sweat under my collar. I loosened my tie. I shouted down at him. I ordered him to stand. I ordered him to lie down. I shook the rifle in front of his nose. I ordered him to remove his hat. I fired a shot over his head. I kicked dust into his face. I stomped down on his old papery shoes with my boots. I ordered him to look at me. I ordered him to lift one finger. He would not even lift one finger. I screamed at him. I broke his nose with my rifle butt. But still he sat on the old milestone, sat and stared. I was so furious I could have wept. I would try a new tack. I knelt down in front of him. I intruded once more into the line, if so vague a thing could be called that, of his gaze. I bared my teeth. I ordered him to sit. I ordered him to stare vacantly. I ordered him not, under threat of death, to focus his eyes. I ordered the blood to flow from his pulpy nose. He obeyed. Or rather, he remained exactly as he was before. I was hardly gratified. I had anticipated a certain satisfaction, a partial restoration of my confidence, but I was disappointed. In fact, I felt more frustrated than ever. I no longer looked at those passing. I knew their reproachful eyes were on me. My back sweat from the intensity of their derision. I set my teeth. It was time. I told him if he did not speak, I would carry out my orders and execute him on the spot. My orders, to be precise, did not specify this place, but on the other hand, they did not exclude it, and if he would not move, what choice did I have? Even as I asked him to speak, I knew he would not. Even while I was forming and emitting the very words, I already was contemplating the old dilemma. If I shot him in the chest, there was a fair chance I would miss or only graze the heart. He would die slowly. It could take several days. I am more humane than to take pleasure in that thought. On the other hand, if I shot him in the head, he would surely die instantly, but it would make a mess of his countenance. I do not enjoy the sight of mutilated heads. I do not. I have often thought myself, when the time came, I would rather receive it in the chest. The chest seems to me farthest away than the head. In fact, I could almost enjoy dying, allowed the slow, dreamy regard of my chest distantly fountaining blood. Contrarily, the thought of the swift, hard knock in the skull is an eternal torment to me. Given these considerations, I shot him in the chest. As I had feared, he did not die immediately. He did not even for the moment alter either his expression or his posture. His coats were thick and many. I could see the holes drilled by the rifle shells, but saw no blood. What could that mean? I was shaken by a sudden violent fever of impatience. Only by strenuous self-control was I able to restrain myself from tearing his clothes off to inspect the wound. I thought, if I don't see blood immediately, I shall lose it again. I was trembling. I wiped my mouth with the back of my hand. Then, slowly, a dark stain began to appear in the tatters. In the nick of time. It spread. I sighed. I sat back and laid the rifle across my knees. Now there was only to wait. I glanced towards the road from time to time and accepted without ceremony the commendatory nods. The stain enlarged. It would not take long. I sat and waited. His coats were soon soaked and the blood dripped down the milestone between his legs. Suddenly his eyes fixed on mine. His lips worked, his teeth chewed his beard. I wished he would end it quickly. I even considered firing a second shot through his head. And then he spoke. He spoke rapidly, desperately, with neither punctuation nor sentence structure, just a ceaseless eruption of obtuse language. He spoke of constellations, bone structures, mythologies, and love. He spoke of belief and lymph nodes, of excavations, categories, and prophecies. Faster and faster he spoke. His eyes gleamed. Harmonics, foliations, etymology, impulses, suffering. His voice rose to a shriek. Immateriality, patricide, ideations, heatstroke, virtue, predication. I grew annoyed and shot him in the head. At last, with this, he fell. My job was done. As I had feared, he was a mess. I turned my back to him, strapped my rifle securely on my back, reknotted my tie. I successfully put his present condition out of my mind, reconstructing my earlier view of him still whole. It was little better, I admit, but it was the first essential step towards forgetting him altogether. In the patrol car, I called in details of the incident and ordered the deposition squad to the scene. I drove a little farther down the road, parked, jotted down the vital data in my memo book. I would make the full report out later, back at the station. I noted the exact time. This done, I returned my memo book to my breast pocket, leaned back, and stared absently out the window. I was restless. My mind was not yet entirely free of the old man. At times he would loom in my inner eye larger than the very landscape. I suppose that this was due to my having stooped down to his level. My motives had been commendable, of course, but the consequences of such a gesture, if practiced habitually, could well prove disastrous. I would avoid it in the future. The rifle jammed against my spine. I slid down farther to relieve the obtrusion, resting my head against the back of the seat. I watched the traffic. Gradually, I became absorbed in it. Uniformly it flowed, quietly, possessed of its own unbroken grace and precision. There was a variety in detail, but the stream itself was one. One. The thought warmed me. It flowed away, and the unpleasant images that had troubled my mind flowed away with it. At last I sat up, started the motor, and entered the flow itself. I felt calm and happy, a participant. I enjoy my work.